When people talk about Derrick Rose, they usually talk about what he used to be. They remember the speed, the explosion, the way he attacked the rim like gravity did not apply to him. They remember the young kid from Chicago who carried an entire city on his back before he was even old enough to fully understand the weight of it. They remember the youngest MVP in NBA history, the player who made fans believe that the Chicago Bulls could finally rise again after the shadow of Michael Jordan had stretched over the franchise for more than a decade. But what is happening to Derrick Rose right now is hard to watch, not because he disappeared in failure, and not because he was never great. It is hard to watch because for so many fans, Derrick Rose still feels unfinished. His story does not feel like a normal career. It feels like a promise that was interrupted. Before the injuries, before the surgeries, before the endless comeback questions, Derrick Rose was not just another star. He was different. He was Chicago's son, born and raised on the South Side. Rose grew up in an environment where basketball was more than a sport. It was a way out, a shield, a dream, and sometimes the only clean path through chaos. By the time he reached the NBA, people were not simply cheering for his talent. They were cheering for his survival. And when the Bulls selected him with the first overall pick in the 2008 NBA draft, it felt almost too perfect. The hometown kid was coming home. Chicago did not have to borrow a hero from somewhere else. This one belonged to them. At first, everything happened so fast that it almost seemed unreal. Rose won Rookie of the Year. He became an All-Star. Then, in 2011, he did something that still sounds impossible. At just 22 years old, he became the youngest, most valuable player the league had ever seen. That season, Derrick Rose was not just good. He was electric. Every night felt like a warning to the rest of the NBA. He did not play the game politely. He attacked it. He twisted through defenders, absorbed contact from bigger men, and finished at angles that made no sense. He was fearless, but not loud. Dominant, but not arrogant. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made him even more magnetic. To Bulls fans, he was more than an athlete. He was hope in sneakers. After years of waiting, Chicago finally had a player who could make them believe again. Every crossover, every dunk, every late-game drive felt like a piece of the city coming back to life. People looked at Derrick Rose and saw a future championship. They saw banners. They saw parades. They saw a new era. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the 2012 playoffs, during a game against the Philadelphia 76ers, Derrick Rose drove toward the basket like he had done thousands of times before. But this time, when he landed, something was wrong. He went down. The arena went quiet. Fans knew immediately that it was bad, even before the reports confirmed it. A torn ACL. 3 words that changed the entire direction of his life. For many players, an injury is a chapter. For Derrick Rose, it became the dividing line between 2 different realities. There was the Rose before the injury and the Rose after it. One was a superhero. The other was a man trying to prove that the superhero had not completely vanished. And that is where the heartbreak begins. Because the cruelest part of Derrick Rose's story is not that he was injured. Injuries happen in sports. The cruelest part is that every time he tried to come back, people expected him to become the old Derrick Rose again. They did not just want him healthy. They wanted him explosive. They wanted him fearless. They wanted the MVP back. But how do you become the same person after your body has betrayed you? Rose returned to the court, but the questions never left him. Was he moving the same? Was he afraid to attack the rim? Was he protecting himself? Would he ever trust his knees again? Every game became an examination. Every missed layup became a headline. Every awkward landing made fans hold their breath. Then came more injuries, more pain, more delays, more doubt. The world that once celebrated him began to question him. Some fans became impatient. Critics wondered if he still had the same drive. People who had never felt that kind of physical or emotional trauma spoke as if recovery were simple. They looked at Derrick Rose and saw a fallen star. But they did not always see the person underneath. They did not see the private fear. They did not see the lonely rehab sessions. They did not see what it does to a man when the thing that made him special is also the thing that keeps breaking him. That is why Derrick Rose's story still hurts. Because he was never just fighting defenders. He was fighting memory. Every time he stepped onto the court, he was competing against the ghost of who he used to be. And for a while, it seemed like that ghost would follow him forever. After the first major injury, Derrick Rose did not just have to recover his body. He had to recover his identity. That is something many fans never fully understood. For most of his life, Rose had been known for one thing above everything else: his athletic gifts. His speed was not normal. His first step was violent. His body control looked impossible. He could split two defenders, absorb contact in the air, switch hands, and finish before anyone else even realized what had happened. That was not just how he played basketball. That was how people defined him. So when his knees began to fail him, it was not just a physical loss. It was personal. Imagine being praised your entire life for flying, then suddenly being told that every landing could destroy you. Imagine hearing crowds chant your name, but knowing they were waiting for a version of you that might never come back. Imagine looking at old highlights of yourself and seeing someone who feels both familiar and unreachable. That was the silent battle Derrick Rose had to face. When he returned to the Chicago Bulls, the attention around him was overwhelming. Fans wanted to believe the nightmare was over. They wanted the old Rose back. They wanted the same ruthless drives, the same acrobatic finishes, the same confidence that had once made him look unstoppable. But inside, things are different. You could see it in the way the world watched him. Every movement was studied. Every game was analyzed like a medical report. If he scored well, people called it a comeback. If he struggled, people wondered if he was finished. That kind of pressure can break a person. And Derrick Rose was never the loud type. He was not the kind of superstar who fed off drama, media attention, or public battles. He was quiet, private, sometimes misunderstood. Because he did not always explain his pain in a way people wanted to hear, they filled in the blanks for him. Some called him soft. Some said he lacked toughness. Some questioned whether he truly wanted to play. But those accusations never matched the reality of his journey. The truth is, Derrick Rose kept coming back when many players might have walked away. He endured surgeries, setbacks, criticism, trades, and the humiliation of being compared to his former self every single night. He had gone from being the face of a franchise to a player fighting just to prove he still belonged. That fall was brutal. Chicago had once looked at Rose as the future. But eventually, even that relationship changed. The Bulls moved on. The hometown fairy tale did not end with a championship parade or a statue outside the arena. It ended with a trade. Rose was sent to the New York Knicks in 2016, and just like that, the player who once seemed destined to spend his whole career in Chicago was gone. For fans, it was painful. For Rose, it had to be even heavier. Leaving Chicago meant leaving the place where his dream had begun, but also the place where his pain had become public. In New York, he had a chance to start again, but the shadow followed him. The questions were still there. Could he stay healthy? Could he be a star again? Was he now just a reminder of what injuries can steal? The next chapter had moments of promise, but it was not a rebirth. Rose could still score. He could still create. He could still show flashes that made people sit up and remember. But the league had changed, and so had he. He was no longer the centerpiece. He was no longer the young MVP everyone feared. He was a veteran guard trying to adapt to a body that no longer gave him unlimited trust. That is one of the hardest transitions in sports. Some players declined slowly. Derrick Rose's career changed violently. One moment, he was a superstar rising toward greatness. The next, he was trying to rebuild himself from the ground up. And every time he showed a glimpse of the old magic, it almost made the story more painful, because fans could not help but ask, what if? What if he had never torn his ACL? What if his knees had held up? What if the Bulls had stayed healthy? What if the league had seen 5 or 10 years of prime Derrick Rose? Those questions still haunt basketball fans because the answer feels enormous. Rose was not simply a good player who got hurt. He was on a path toward becoming one of the defining guards of his generation. He had already won MVP before entering what should have been his true prime. His combination of speed, strength, fearlessness, and humility made him rare. He was not chasing attention. He was chasing greatness. But greatness can be fragile. After New York, his journey became even more uncertain. He had short stops, changing roles, and moments when it seemed like the NBA might be moving on without him. There was a time when people wondered whether Derrick Rose's career was close to ending quietly. Not with a farewell tour. Not with standing ovations in every arena. Just a slow fade from the spotlight. And then came one of the most emotional nights of his life. On October 31st, 2018, playing for the Minnesota Timberwolves, Derrick Rose scored 50 points against the Utah Jazz. It was not just a great performance. It was a release, a scream, a reminder. After everything he had been through, after all the injuries, all the doubts, all the cruel jokes and dismissive comments, Rose gave the world one more unforgettable night. When the final buzzer sounded, he was overwhelmed. His face showed everything he had been carrying. The pain, the relief, the years of frustration, the burden of being written off. That 50-point game was not about proving he was the same player from 2011. It was about proving he was still here. That mattered. For one night, Derrick Rose was not a tragedy. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not a broken superstar. He was a survivor standing in the middle of the court, reminding everyone that even after the world stops believing in you, you can still find something inside yourself that refuses to die. But even that beautiful moment could not erase the full weight of his story. Because the truth is, Derrick Rose's career was always going to be measured against the future he lost. No matter how much he reinvented himself, no matter how respected he became as a veteran, no matter how many fans admired his resilience, there would always be that painful comparison between what happened and what could have happened. And that is why watching Derrick Rose now feels so emotional. He is no longer the young star carrying Chicago's championship dreams. He is no longer the fastest player on the floor. He is no longer fighting for MVP trophies or trying to become the face of the league. Instead, he has become something quieter, something deeper, and in some ways, something more human. He became proof that survival can be its own kind of greatness. But the heartbreak is that survival was never supposed to be the main story. As Derrick Rose moved deeper into the second half of his career, the NBA slowly stopped looking at him as a superstar trying to return his throne. Instead, teams began to see him as something different, a veteran, a mentor, a spark off the bench, a player who could still change a game in short bursts, but no longer someone expected to carry an entire franchise. That transition might sound simple from the outside, but for a player like Rose, it carried a quiet sadness. Because once you have been the center of everything, learning to exist on the edges can be painful. He had been the face on billboards. He had been the name on every ticket. He had been the reason national television cameras came to Chicago. He had been the player young guards studied, fans defended, and opponents feared. Then, slowly, he became the veteran sitting near the end of the bench, waiting for his minutes, waiting for his chance, waiting for a coach to decide when his body and experience were still useful. That is not failure, but it is a kind of grief. For athletes, aging does not happen privately. It happens in front of thousands of people. Every missed shot becomes evidence. Every slower step becomes a discussion. Every reduced role becomes a headline. Derrick Rose had to go through that process while millions of people remembered exactly what he looked like when he was untouchable. And yet, he never turned bitter. That is one of the most underrated parts of his story. Rose could have become angry at the game. He could have blamed the Bulls, blamed doctors, blamed critics, blamed fate, or blamed the fans who questioned him. He could have lived inside resentment. Instead, he adapted. He simplified his game. He became smarter with his movements. He learned when to attack, when to slow down, when to use angles instead of pure explosion. The player who once overwhelmed defenders with athletic violence began surviving through craft. And in that version of Derrick Rose, there was still beauty. He could still get to his spots. He could still hit floaters. He could still slice into the lane with that familiar left to right rhythm. Every now and then, he would rise for a finish, and for 1 second, fans would feel the past rushing back. It was never exactly the same, but it was enough to remind everyone that the old Rose had not completely disappeared. He was still in there, buried beneath scar tissue, experience, and years of pain. His second stint with the New York Knicks gave fans another emotional chapter. Under coach Tom Thibodeau, the same coach who had guided him during his MVP season in Chicago, Rose found a role that made sense. He was not asked to be the savior anymore. He was asked to be steady, to lead, to score when needed, to calm a game down, to show younger players what professionalism looked like after a career full of storms. For a while it worked. Knicks fans embraced him. Bulls fans still loved him. Neutral fans respected him. Even people who had once doubted him began to understand the magnitude of what he had survived. Derrick Rose was no longer judged only by the heights he failed to reach. He was being appreciated for the fact that he was still standing. But professional sports rarely offer clean endings. Eventually, his role in New York faded. Minutes became inconsistent. Younger players needed opportunities. The organization moved in another direction. Once again, Rose found himself pushed toward the margins, not because he lacked heart, but because time had continued doing what time always does. Then came Memphis. In 2023, Derrick Rose signed with the Memphis Grizzlies, a team filled with young talent and energy. On paper, it looked like a fitting place for him to become a veteran presence. He could mentor young guards, stabilize the locker room, and provide leadership from someone who had seen every side of NBA life. Fame, pressure, injury, criticism, rebirth, and decline. But even there, the story felt bittersweet. Rose was no longer chasing stardom. He was no longer trying to prove he could be the MVP again. He was simply trying to finish the game on his own terms. But injuries and limited appearances continued to follow him. His body, which had once made him seem superhuman, remained the one thing that never fully allowed him peace. That is what makes this stage of Derrick Rose's life hard to watch. Not because he is broken, not because he should be pitted, but because fans know how much basketball took from him, even while it gave him everything. The game gave him fame, wealth, respect, and a place in history. But it also took years of his prime. It took the natural arc that a player of his talent deserved. It took away the chance to see what would have happened if his body had matched his heart. And then, in 2024, Derrick Rose finally stepped away. After 16 seasons in the NBA, he announced his retirement. For some athletes, retirement feels like celebration. For Derrick Rose, it felt more complicated. There was gratitude, of course. There was admiration. There was love from fans all over the world. But there was also a sense of mourning, because his retirement did not just close a career. It closed one of basketball's most painful what-if stories. The league said goodbye to a former MVP, but fans said goodbye to something more personal. They said goodbye to the kid from Chicago who made them believe. They said goodbye to the fearless driver who played like every possession was an act of defiance. They said goodbye to the man who kept coming back, even after his own body seemed determined to stop him. And maybe that is why Derrick Rose's story still feels unfinished, even now. Because people do not only remember what he achieved, they remember what he was becoming. They remember the feeling that he was just getting started. They remember watching him win MVP at 22 and thinking, this is only the beginning. But sometimes the beginning is the highest point. That is a painful truth in sports, and Derrick Rose became one of its most powerful examples. His peak was so bright, so sudden, and so unforgettable that everything after it had to live in its shadow. But the shadow does not erase the light. In many ways, it makes people appreciate it more. Rose's greatness was not long, but it was real. For one incredible stretch, he was the most explosive guard in basketball. He changed the energy of the Bulls. He terrified defenses. He gave Chicago a reason to dream again. Nobody can take that away from him. Injuries changed the story, but they did not delete the chapters that came before. And now, as fans look back, the sadness comes with a strange kind of pride. Because Derrick Rose did not get the career people expected. He did not become the dynasty leader many predicted. He did not win a championship in Chicago. He did not spend 15 years as an MVP-level superstar. But he did something that may be just as difficult. He survived the collapse of his own legend. And somehow, he still found a way to be loved. For many former superstars, the hardest part of retirement is silence. No more arenas shaking before tip-off. No more cameras waiting by the locker room. No more thousands of fans rising at once when you touch the ball. No more opponents preparing an entire defensive plan just to stop you from getting downhill. No more feeling that for 2 hours, the entire world has to react to your movement. For Derrick Rose, that silence carries a different weight. Because his career was never quiet. Even when he did not speak much, the noise around him was constant. Expectations were loud. Criticism was loud. Injuries were loud. Comebacks were loud. The memories were loud. And now, after all those years of fighting to stay on the floor, he has stepped away from the one place where people always looked for proof of who he still was. That is what makes this moment feel so emotional. Derrick Rose is not just retired. He is finally free from the weekly judgment that followed him for more than a decade. No one can ask after every game if he is back. No one can compare his box score to the MVP season. No one can freeze a clip of him landing awkwardly and turn it into another debate about his future. No one can demand that he become the impossible version of himself again. But freedom can feel strange when it comes after so much pain. For years, Rose's life was built around recovery. Rehab became routine. Ice treatment, strength work, mobility work, medical evaluations, minute restrictions, training camps, setbacks, and cautious returns. To the outside world, he was a famous athlete with money and status. But behind that image was a man whose body had become a daily project. Every season was not just about basketball. It was about maintenance. It was about survival. That kind of life changes a person. And when it ends, there is relief, but there is also emptiness. Because the thing that hurt him was also the thing that defined him. Basketball gave Derrick Rose his identity before the world even knew his name. It took him from the south side of Chicago to national fame. It turned him into a symbol. It gave him the platform to change his family's life forever. But it also forced him to live through repeated public heartbreak. That contradiction is what makes his story so powerful. Fans look at Derrick Rose and see inspiration. But inspiration does not erase suffering. A comeback story can be beautiful and still be painful. A survivor can be celebrated and still carry scars that nobody sees. Sometimes the public turns an athlete's pain into motivation, but forgets that the athlete had to actually live through it. Rose lived through all of it. He lived through the moment when his knee gave out and the future changed instantly. He lived through the endless speculation about whether he would return. He lived through being mocked for protecting his body. He lived through trades, reduced roles, uncertain contracts, and seasons where his name felt bigger than his current place in the league. He lived through the emotional burden of being remembered more for what was taken from him than for what he still gave. And yet, he never completely lost the fans. That is rare. Usually, when an athlete's career does not meet early expectations, the public moves on. People become cruel. They label the player a disappointment. They reduce an entire human being to a failed projection. But Derrick Rose was different. Even when people debated him, even when they criticized him, there was always a deep affection underneath. Fans did not just respect his talent. They felt protective of his story. Because Derrick Rose represented something that went beyond basketball. He represented the dream that almost made it. Every sports fan understands that feeling. The player who should have one more. The team that should have gone further. The moment that should have led to a dynasty, but instead became a memory. Rose became the face of that kind of heartbreak. Not because he lacked greatness, but because his greatness was interrupted before it could fully unfold. And now, with his playing days over, people are finally beginning to appreciate the whole picture. The MVP award matters. The highlights matter. The Rookie of the Year season matters. The All-Star appearances matter. The 50-point night in Minnesota matters. But so does everything after the fall. The quiet professionalism, the humility, the willingness to accept smaller roles. The way he mentored younger players. The way he kept showing up when the easy thing would have been to vanish. That is the part of Derrick Rose's legacy that grows stronger with time. At first, people saw him as a tragic superstar. Then they saw him as a comeback story. But now, maybe they can see him as something more complete. A man who carried both glory and pain without letting either one fully define him. That is not easy. Many athletes spend their lives chasing control. They control their training, their diet, their schedule, their body, their performance, their public image. But Derrick Rose's career is a reminder that some things cannot be controlled, no matter how gifted or disciplined someone is. A single landing can change history. A single injury can redirect a franchise. A single moment can separate a player from the destiny everyone imagined for him. That is why fans still talk about him with such emotion. Because Derrick Rose makes people confront the fragile side of greatness. We like to believe that talent always wins. We like to believe that hard work guarantees the ending. We like to believe that if someone is special enough, nothing can stop them. But Rose's journey says something more complicated. It says that greatness is not always protected. It says that even the most gifted athletes are human. It says that sometimes the story does not reward the person the way we think it should. And still, Derrick Rose found meaning. He did not win a championship. He did not become the long-term face of the NBA. He did not rewrite the record books the way some thought he might. But he left something behind that may last even longer than statistics. He left a feeling. Ask any Bulls fan who watched him in 2011, and they can tell you where they were. They can remember the electricity. They can remember the belief. They can remember what it felt like to look at a young player and think, we have him, and nobody else does. That emotional connection does not disappear just because injuries change the ending. In fact, it may be stronger because of the pain. Derrick Rose's career became a story about love without perfection. Fans loved him not only because he rose, but because he fell and kept trying. They loved the MVP, but they also loved the veteran. They loved the impossible layups, but they also loved the quiet resilience. They loved the superstar, but they also loved the man who had to rebuild himself piece by piece. That is why what is happening to Derrick Rose right now is hard to watch. Because watching him step away forces everyone to accept that the dream is truly over. There will be no final comeback. No sudden return to MVP form. No last playoff run where he carries Chicago to glory. No magical ending that fixes the past. But maybe the story never needed to be fixed. Maybe Derrick Rose's legacy is not about what was missing. Maybe it is about what remained. His knees failed him, but his spirit did not. His prime was stolen, but his impact survived. His career changed direction, but his name still means something powerful to millions of people. And in the end, that may be the most Derrick Rose thing of all. He did not finish the way people expected. He finished as proof that even a broken dream can still become legendary. What makes Derrick Rose's retirement so difficult to process is that it does not feel like the end of a normal basketball career. It feels like the closing of a wound that never fully healed. For years, fans kept a small part of themselves waiting. Even when they knew the old Derrick Rose was probably never coming back, they still hoped. Maybe there would be one more run. Maybe one more team would give him the perfect role. Maybe one playoff series would remind everyone who he used to be. Maybe, somehow, he would return to Chicago and receive the ending that felt stolen from him. That is what sports does to people. It makes them believe in impossible timing. But Derrick Rose's story was never about perfect timing. In many ways, it was about timing being cruel. He reached his highest point before most players even enter their prime. At 22, he was already an MVP. He was already the face of one of the most historic franchises in the league. He was already being discussed as the future of the NBA. And then, just when the story should have expanded, it cracked. That is the part people still cannot let go. Because fans did not just lose years of Derrick Rose. They lost an imagined future. They lost the playoff battles that never happened. They lost the Bulls dynasty that never arrived. They lost the version of Rose that could have battled LeBron James year after year in the Eastern Conference. They lost the chance to see how far his game would have evolved once his mind caught up with his athleticism. They lost the possibility of a player who might have changed the entire shape of the 2010s. Those things never officially existed, but they still feel real to fans. That is why his name carries so much emotion. Derrick Rose is not remembered only for what he did. He is remembered for what people believed he was about to do. That is a heavy kind of legacy because it means his career lives partly in memory and partly in imagination. Every highlight reel becomes both celebration and evidence. Every explosive dunk reminds people of greatness, but also reminds them of how suddenly it was interrupted. And now, as Rose moves into life after basketball, the question becomes different. Not can he come back? Not can he stay healthy? Not can he still be the old Rose? Now the question is, how does a man live after being chased by his own legend for half his life? That may be the most human part of this whole story. Derrick Rose spent so many years being compared to a version of himself that no longer existed. Even when he played well, the praise often came with sadness. People would say he looked like vintage Rose for a night, as if the current man was only valuable when he resembled the past. That is a difficult way to live. It means your own younger self becomes your biggest opponent. And younger Derrick Rose was almost impossible to compete with. He was fearless. He was fast beyond logic. He played with the kind of physical confidence that cannot be manufactured. He could turn a normal possession into a moment people remembered for years. He made defenders look helpless. He made arenas gasp. He made Chicago feel dangerous again. But older Derrick Rose gave fans something different. He gave them perspective. He showed what it looks like when a superstar has to become a role player and still carry himself with dignity. He showed what it looks like to keep loving the game after the game has hurt you. He showed younger players that careers do not always follow the script and that humility becomes necessary when talent alone is no longer enough. In a league obsessed with status, Rose accepted reinvention. That acceptance may be one of his greatest victories, because many stars cannot survive the loss of being central. They struggle when the offense no longer runs through them. They struggle when the media stops asking the biggest questions. They struggle when the crowd cheers a little less loudly. But Derrick Rose, despite all the pain, found ways to contribute. He became a calming presence. He became a reminder that fame is temporary, but respect can last. And respect is what he has now. Around the NBA, Derrick Rose is not treated like a failure. He is treated like a player whose story made people feel something. Opponents admired him. Teammates valued him. Fans across different cities embraced him. Even people who never supported the Bulls understood what Rose meant to basketball. His career became bigger than one franchise, even though Chicago will always be the emotional center of it. That connection with Chicago is impossible to separate from his legacy. Derrick Rose was not just drafted by the Bulls. He was raised by the same city that later placed championship dreams on his shoulders. That made the love deeper, but it also made the pain sharper. When he succeeded, Chicago felt proud in a personal way. When he got hurt, the city felt wounded with him. When he left, it felt like the ending of a family story that had gone wrong. Yet the bond never disappeared. Even after the trades, even after the different jerseys, even after the years passed, Derrick Rose remained Chicago's son. Fans still wore his jersey. They still chanted for him. They still defended him in arguments. They still treated his name with a kind of tenderness that few athletes ever receive. That kind of love is not built only on championships. It is built on identification. People saw themselves in Rose. They saw the kid trying to escape difficult circumstances. They saw the quiet worker who did not need to brag. They saw the person who was blessed with talent, but punished by bad luck. They saw someone who kept taking hits and kept standing back up. That is why his story traveled beyond basketball. It became a story about life, refusing to go according to plan. And that is why watching him now is hard. Because retirement means the fight is no longer visible. For so many years, fans could measure his resilience through games. If he checked into the lineup, that meant he was still battling. If he scored, it meant he still had something left. If he smiled after a big play, it meant the pain had not taken everything. But now, there are no more box scores to read. No more comeback games to circle. No more moments where the crowd can rise and tell him, one more time, that they still believe. Now all fans could do is look back. And when they look back, they see a career that refuses to fit into a simple category. Was Derrick Rose a tragedy? In some ways, yes. Was he a success? Absolutely. Was he robbed? Without question. Was he still great? More than enough. That complexity is what makes his story last. It cannot be reduced to awards, injuries, or missed opportunities. It is all of those things at once. Derrick Rose's life after basketball may become quieter, but his place in basketball history is secure. He will always be the youngest MVP. He will always be the hometown hero who made Chicago believe again. He will always be the player whose highlights still feel like they came from another dimension. He will always be the man who cried after scoring 50 because the world finally saw his heart again. He will always be the reminder that careers can be damaged without being destroyed. That is the part fans need to remember. Derrick Rose did not get the ending everyone wanted, but he did not lose the meaning of his journey. His story is painful because it was beautiful first, and maybe that is why it still matters so much. People do not mourn average dreams. They mourn the ones that once looked destined to come true. Rose gave fans the kind of dream, and even though the dream broke, the memory of it still shines. For Derrick Rose, the hardest opponent was never another point guard. It was not Rajon Rondo. It was not Chris Paul. It was not Russell Westbrook. It was not LeBron James waiting at the rim, or an entire Miami Heat defense loading up to stop him from getting into the paint. Those battles were real, but they were part of the game. They were the kind of challenges great players expect. The opponent that changed Derrick Rose's life was time. Time took the young legs that once made him look impossible. Time turned explosive drives into calculated movements. Time turned MVP chants into nostalgic applause. Time turned a player once seen as the future into a symbol of the past. And time is undefeated, even against athletes who once seemed built to outrun it. That is why his story hits so deeply. Derrick Rose's career is not just about injuries. It is about the way life can move a person from one identity to another before they are ready. One day, he was the most exciting young player in the NBA. Then suddenly, he was a patient, a question mark, a comeback story, a trade piece, a veteran, and finally, a retired legend. Each version of him was real, but fans often struggled to accept the transition because the first version was so unforgettable. The MVP version of Derrick Rose was almost too powerful in memory. He played like someone trying to break through the limits of the sport itself. He did not float around the three-point line waiting for the game to come to him. He forced the game to react. He drove into crowds. He bent defenses. He made huge men backpedal in panic. He had a way of attacking the basket that felt reckless and controlled at the same time, as if he knew exactly how close he could get to disaster without falling into it. Then disaster arrived anyway. And after that, every chapter of his career carried the sound of what had been lost. Even when he had good nights, the past stood beside him. Even when he reinvented himself, the question remained, what if this had been the foundation instead of the recovery? What if this smarter, calmer, more experienced version of Rose had been added to a healthy MVP body? What would that player have become? That question may never stop hurting. But there is another side to Derrick Rose's legacy that deserves just as much attention. He did not only inspire people through dominance. He inspired them through endurance. That is much harder to do. Dominance is easy to admire. Everyone loves a winner. Everyone loves the player who looks invincible. But endurance asks something deeper from fans. It asks them to watch a person struggle, fail, change, and continue anyway. That is what Derrick Rose gave people. He gave them a model of survival without pretending survival was glamorous. He was not always smiling. He was not always saying the perfect thing. He was not trying to turn every setback into a motivational speech. Sometimes he looked tired. Sometimes he looked guarded. Sometimes he looked like a man who had heard the same questions too many times. And that made him more human, not less. In a sports culture that often demands emotional performance from athletes, Rose's quietness became meaningful. He did not need to explain every scar. He did not owe the public a detailed map of his pain. He simply kept working, kept returning, and kept finding ways to belong in a league that had once expected him to rule it. That kind of humility is rare. There were many moments when ego could have ruined him. After being an MVP, he could have refused smaller roles. After being a franchise star, he could have resented coming off the bench. After being celebrated as Chicago's savior, he could have treated every new stop as beneath him. But Rose did not build his later years on bitterness. He accepted what the game gave him, even when it was much less than what the game once promised. That acceptance should not be mistaken for weakness. It takes strength to adjust when life changes the terms. It takes strength to keep showing up when people only want to talk about who you used to be. It takes strength to sit with younger teammates, share lessons, and know that some of them will have opportunities your body never allowed you to finish. Derrick Rose did that. He became the kind of veteran whose value could not always be captured in highlights. And maybe that is why players respect him so much. They understand what casual fans sometimes miss. They understand the hours of rehab behind one game. They understand how difficult it is to trust your body after a major injury. They understand that losing athleticism is not like losing a jump shot. It changes the way the court feels. It changes the decisions you make. It changes the way defenders guard you. It changes your confidence before you even touch the ball. Rose had to relearn the game while the whole world watched. That is a level of vulnerability most people never experience. His setbacks were not private. They became breaking news. His returns were not personal milestones. They became national debates. His body was discussed like public property. His pain became content. And still, somehow, he preserved enough of himself to continue. That may be the real victory. Not the MVP, not the awards, not the records. Those things matter, but they belong to the public resume. The deeper victory is that Derrick Rose reached the end of his career still respected, still loved, and still himself. The game changed him, but it did not hollow him out. It took his prime, but it did not take his dignity. And now, as he stands beyond the court, his story enters a different phase. Fans will keep replaying the highlights. They will keep debating his Hall of Fame case. They will keep asking where he ranks among the greatest what-if players in NBA history. They will keep remembering the dunks, the acrobatic layups, the impossible bursts of speed. But over time, the emotional center of his story may shift. It may become less about what injuries stole and more about what Rose protected. He protected his love for the game. He protected his connection to Chicago. He protected his humility. He protected the respect of a basketball world that watched him fall from the top and still rise again in a different form. That is not the career people imagined in 2011. It is not the fairy tale people wanted, but it is a real legacy, and maybe that matters more. Fairy tales are clean. Derrick Rose's story was never clean. It was messy, painful, inspiring, frustrating, beautiful, and unfinished in the way real life often is. The young Derrick Rose gave fans a dream. The older Derrick Rose gave him a lesson. The dream was that greatness could arrive suddenly, wearing a Bulls jersey, moving faster than everyone else, making an entire city believe again. The lesson was that even when greatness is wounded, it can still leave a mark. Even when the ending changes, the story can still matter. Even when the world remembers what you lost, you can still decide what remains. That is why Derrick Rose will never be remembered as just another injured star. He became something more complicated and more lasting. He became proof that a career can be heartbreaking and successful at the same time. He became proof that the public can mourn what never happened while still honoring what did. He became proof that a man can lose the version of himself everyone loved most and still earn a different kind of love. And maybe that is what makes watching Derrick Rose now so hard. It is not that he failed. It is that he gave everything, lost more than most, and still walked away with grace. There is a reason Derrick Rose's name still makes NBA fans pause. It is not only because of the MVP trophy. It is not only because of the highlights. It is not only because of the injuries. It is because his story sits in a painful space between greatness and grief. He became everything fans hoped he would become, but only for a moment. Then that moment was stretched into a lifetime of wondering what could have been. That kind of story does not fade easily. When people remember Derrick Rose, they do not remember him like a normal retired player. They remember him like a feeling. They remember the sudden roar of the United Center when he turned the corner. They remember defenders collapsing into the paint because everyone in the building knew he was coming, and still no one could stop him. They remember the way his body seemed to hang in the air just long enough to change direction, switch hands, and finish through contact. He was not just fast. He was violent with space. He attacked openings before they fully existed. He made decisions at a speed that forced defenders into panic. His game had a kind of controlled chaos that made every possession feel dangerous. When Rose had the ball at the top of the key, fans leaned forward because something could happen at any second. A crossover, a burst, a spin, a collision, a finish that looked impossible until it went in. That is why the fall was so devastating. It was not just that an athlete got hurt. It was that one of the most exciting styles of basketball anyone had ever seen became dangerous to the person performing it. The same explosiveness that made Derrick Rose extraordinary also placed impossible stress on his body. The same fearless drives that made fans worship him became part of the reason every landing felt terrifying after the injury. That is the cruel irony at the center of his career. The gift and the damage were connected. Rose did not become beloved by playing carefully. He became beloved by attacking the game with his whole body. He played as if hesitation was not in his vocabulary. That is what made him special. But after the injuries, hesitation became unavoidable. Not because he lacked courage, but because experience teaches the body things the mind cannot ignore. Pain changes instinct. A healthy young player jumps without thinking. An injured player remembers. He remembers the pop, the collapse, the silence, the months of rehab. He remembers every time he trusted his body and it failed him. He remembers that one wrong step can become a season lost. And still, Derrick Rose kept going back into the game. That should never be overlooked. Fans often talk about toughness as if it only means playing through contact or yelling after a dunk. But Derrick Rose showed a different kind of toughness. He showed the toughness of returning to the same place where your dream was damaged. He showed the toughness of facing people who doubted your courage. He showed the toughness of accepting that your best days may be behind you, while still refusing to let the rest of your days become meaningless. That is not weakness. That is endurance. And endurance is why his story connects so deeply with people outside basketball. Most people will never win an MVP. Most people will never play in the NBA. Most people will never hear an arena chanting their name. But many people understand what it feels like to lose a version of themselves. They understand what it feels like to be changed by something they did not choose. They understand the frustration of trying to move forward while others keep comparing them to who they used to be. In that way, Derrick Rose became more relatable after the injuries, not less. The young MVP was almost mythical. The injured veteran was human. He was still gifted, still respected, still capable of brilliance, but he was no longer untouchable. Fans saw his limits. They saw his frustration. They saw the nights when he looked like he still had it, and the nights when time looked heavier than talent. They saw a man trying to rebuild his career in real time. That vulnerability made people love him differently. At first, they loved him because he made them dream. Later, they loved him because he refused to disappear when the dream changed. That second kind of love may be quieter, but it is deeper. It does not depend on championships or MVP votes. It depends on memory, empathy, and respect. That is why his retirement hit so hard. When Derrick Rose finally walked away from the NBA, it felt like fans were being forced to close a book they had been unwilling to finish. For years, there was always one more page, one more comeback, one more role, one more team. One more flash of vintage Rose that made people believe, even briefly, that the story still had a surprise left. Retirement ended that hope. It made everything final. The MVP season was no longer the beginning of a larger dynasty. The injuries were no longer obstacles he might fully overcome. The 50-point game was no longer a possible preview of another rise. Chicago was no longer waiting for a final heroic return. The story had become history. And history is colder than hope. Hope lets people imagine. History asks them to accept. Accept that Derrick Rose's peak was short. Accept that his prime was interrupted. Accept that the Bulls never got the championship run fans dreamed about. Accept that one of the most beloved players of his generation spent much of his career fighting just to remain on the floor. Accept that there is no alternate ending coming. But acceptance does not have to mean sadness only. It can also mean gratitude. Because even with everything that went wrong, Derrick Rose still gave basketball something unforgettable. He gave the Bulls their most emotional post-Jordan era. He gave fans one of the most explosive MVP seasons ever. He gave young players a model of humility. He gave injured athletes a symbol of persistence. He gave the NBA a story that cannot be told without feeling something. That is rare. Many great players are remembered with admiration. Derrick Rose is remembered with emotion. There's a difference. Admiration says he was great. Emotion says, I still feel what he meant. Rose belongs to that second category. His numbers matter, but they do not fully explain him. His awards matter, but they do not fully contain him. His injuries matter, but they do not fully define him. The full story is bigger than all of it. It is about a boy from Chicago who became the pride of his city. It is about a young star who reached the top faster than anyone expected. It is about a body that could not carry the full weight of the dream. It is about falling, returning, changing, and surviving. It is about the painful truth that some legends are not built by perfect endings, but by unforgettable beginnings and courageous aftermaths. That may be Derrick Rose's final gift to the game. He showed that a career does not have to be complete to be legendary. It does not have to follow the ideal path to matter. It does not have to end with a championship parade to live forever in people's hearts. Sometimes the story that hurts the most is the one people remember the longest. And Derrick Rose's story hurts because it was real. It was not a manufactured drama. It was not a simple rise and fall headline. It was a human story played out under bright lights, where everyone could see the glory, but not everyone understood the cost. Now that the lights are quieter, fans are left with the full picture: the greatness, the pain, the resilience, and the unanswered questions. What is happening to Derrick Rose right now is hard to watch because it means the dream has finally stopped moving. But the legacy has not. The dream ended when he stepped away from the court. The legacy continues every time someone watches his highlights, hears his name, or remembers the way he made Chicago believe again.